Hey y'all. Welcome to week 6. Before we jump into our lecture of the week, just some housekeeping stuff. We do have 3 assigned readings for the week. Watch the mini lecture. Congrats, you're doing it. We're going to watch our friends' presentations, and we have a soft chalk due, and then we also have to complete the mid-semester feedback survey. We have received all of your guys' book reviews. Thank you very much for your hard work put into that. The goal is to get them graded and back to you guys by this Friday, but if it does not happen in that timely manner, just know we are working on them. All right, cool. All right, cool. So what's on the agenda for this week? This lecture is going to cover an array of things. I'm going to try my best to stay on topic, but I am a jumper. So we're going to be covering the opioid epidemic, kind of the timeline. I'm going to go into that, what that entails, go into kind of how we got into this fentanyl crisis and what the withdrawal from the opioid kind of looks like. I'm also going to kind of go into the treatment approaches. We are not going to cover any kind of like CBT, any kind of therapy based models. That's going to be covered in week 9. So we are just going to truly identify what the treatment approach is as far as abstinence based versus harm reduction and kind of what they're used for, and going to cover some medication assisted treatment. So before we jump into it, I want to ask you guys some questions. You don't have to write it down or anything, but just kind of chew on it for a sec. So, how do you define recovery? Right here, right now, what is your thoughts on recovery? So, like, what does a successful recovery look like? Who defines a successful recovery? Is it the patient? Is it the system? Is it us as therapists? How would you know if someone has, quote, recovered? What would that look like? And as therapists, as clinicians, what are we actually trying to restore? Are we going for abstinence? Are we looking for safety? Are we restoring dignity to the person or their functionality? So, what does recovery really mean to you right now? All right. So how do we get here? I like to think of the opioid epidemic in like 3 waves. So the first wave from 99 to 2012 is really the prescription phase. So there were a lot of, unethical doctors operating out of, kind of shady places and giving prescriptions long term to users. This is kind of where the term like pill mill is kind of coined. So people are staying on these prescription drugs for 4 years at a time when we know opioids are only supposed to be used for acute form. So think 3, 5, 7 days. And so at its peak in 2012, there were 259 million prescriptions written, which is like 1% of the population, which, okay, so we think of like not a lot of people, but the military is 1% of the population. And I think that's a lot. So then in 2013, we move into kind of our crackdown time. The government kind of wises up and is like, oh yeah, no, this is bad. So then all of these places are shut down, doctors are losing their license, and opioids now become harder to get. And what we know about like supply and demand, right? So supply goes down, demand goes up, prices go up. So now our prescription drugs are selling on the streets for like $30 to $80 per pill, and that's a lot of money. So people are turning to heroin because it is less expensive at that time. So now we go from prescription drug users to now heroin users. And then in 2013, this is when we first detect fentanyl. We didn't know what it was until this point. It was first detected in Ohio, in Rhode Island, and the overdoses just like look different. And it was in a condensed area where it was happening. So it was a high number of overdoses in a condensed area, and then people started to kind of look into it, thinking that it was like a bad batch of drugs, and then heroin was detected. So it steadily continues to come over at this point. It comes from China. China is the main manufacturer of fentanyl, and at this point, you can directly mail it to the US. So people were very unaware that their drugs were being cut with fentanyl at this point. So we then continue, it continues to grow. Deaths are coming, but we kind of unfortunately don't really pay attention to it. We do, but we don't, until about 2016, and we were like, oh, this is a problem, because at that point it's about 30% of all deaths have fentanyl in them. But also the big push where first responders started to overdose. So they were going to calls, and they would be exposed to fentanyl, and they would overdose themselves. And so that's really what started the movement, to really get kind of ahead of this, I guess. And then we started to crack down on China's input of fentanyl to the US. So this is where like a lot of campaigns start kind of coming out too. So, but then COVID hit and everything kind of went to crap, I guess. So in 2023 is the peak of our fentanyl overdoses, with over 110,000 deaths, and 70% of all deaths now have fentanyl in them. But good news, in 2024, we have seen our first decline in overdoses since this crisis began, which is incredible. And this really isn't important to this topic, but I like to know these things. So if China's our main manufacturer of fentanyl, and then we cut it down in 2013, and we stopped the supply of it, then how is it getting over here? It's Mexico, right? So now China just is able to take it to Mexico, and then Mexico traffics it in, because Mexico supplies about 90% of our heroin. It's the same trade cycles, if you will. So that's where we get it from. All right, so we know how we got here. So why can't you just stop, right? So we know the two drugs that can kill us if we do just stop, right, is alcohol if we are too dependent on it, and benzodiazepines. So opioids, you're not going to die from withdrawal, so just stop taking it, right? The first 1 to 7 days, so your acute symptoms of the withdrawal, you're going to feel like you are dying, okay? You have the worst flu of your life. Your body aches, vomiting, diarrhea, you're sweating, chilly, you have depression, you're experiencing anxiety, right? So if you think back to, I'm sure you guys have had the flu. I've had the flu recently. All you want to do is sleep, right? You want to sleep off the virus and just feel better. The kicker about an opioid withdrawal is you cannot sleep either. So you are in the worst shape of your life and you can't sleep. So the first 1 to 7 days is pretty tough for a lot of people. Okay, so we have now gotten through our acute withdrawal symptoms. We are maybe day 7 and we don't have the flu anymore. So we're cured, right? Then we just don't have to think about opioids anymore, right? No. So this is kind of where the real work kind of comes in when you are detoxing off an opioid. So our brain chemicals are changed. We have stopped making our feel good chemicals, and our brain really becomes dependent on this drug to feel normal. The example I kind of like to give is melatonin, because it's in the news. People talk about melatonin all the time. It's easy to get your hands on, right? It's over the counter. So Melatonin, we make melatonin naturally in our brains, right? It helps us to go to sleep. So then we have trouble sleeping for whatever reason, and we go to our CVS and get some gummy melatonins, and we take them every night for sleep, right? So then our bodies say, if you're going to give this to me in gummy form every night, well, I'm not going to produce my own melatonin. I'm going to focus on other things, right? So then our bodies just stop making it because you're giving it to us. And then you stop taking melatonin for whatever reason, and then you go through a withdrawal from the melatonin and you can't sleep because your body doesn't produce it anymore. So it takes a time to kind of figure out, oh, you're not giving this to us anymore. Okay, and then I have to start producing it again, right? It's the same concept, okay? But then you go into something called pause, so post-acute withdrawal symptoms from an opioid. So this can, be the first month to a year, really. Kind of peaks about 6 months. So it's just you feel terrible. Everything is very bleak, right? Because you are below that baseline. So there's really no pleasure in anything. Nothing is really spiking your dopamine naturally anymore. You don't really have any motivation. Everything just kind of feels gray and pointless, right? A lot of depression coming into this time frame. Can't sleep, you have anxiety, you really just feel like crap. And this can last, again, for a year, right? So your survival circuits are really hijacked from this drug. I want you to think about if you haven't ate for like 2 days, right? So you're really, really hungry. And the only thing you kind of focus on is a cheeseburger because you were so hungry, right? But now imagine it 10 times stronger. That's the only thing you can focus on, right? That's the only thing you think about is that cheeseburger for every minute of every day, 4 months, right? And that is your craving. Your brain now thinks about an opioid the same way it does as food and water. I need this to survive. Your body says, I need the opioid to survive also, right? And then your environment doesn't automatically change after quitting to use the opioid, right? So you are still going in your same car that you maybe used in. You are going around the same people. You're driving past the same place. You're going to the same work. Everything really remains the same. And that is a huge trigger for a lot of people also. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit and we're going to talk about more of treatment options, but I'm going to talk pretty heavily about harm reduction. And I've gotten this in the past, the question about why is it so heavily focused on opioids and not other maybe substances? And the answer is because it is so deadly, right? So if you overdose from an opioid, you die. Okay, there's no going back from that. But other drugs are not so lethal, right? There are some harm reduction strategies for alcohol, but as a whole, right, if you smoke too much cannabis, you're just going to get really sick, right? You're not going to die. So that's why harm reduction is so focused within the opioid population. So let's start with the abstinence model, which the abstinence model has historically been the dominant framework for addiction treatment within the United States. So the 12-step model, particularly AA, takes the what we kind of call the entire abstinence stance. It just means the goal is complete and permanent stopping of all substance use, right? So within this framework, addiction is seen as progressive, it's a chronic illness, and the attempts at moderations are kind of viewed as part of the illness itself. And the belief that someone someday can control their usage is really considered very risky or even dangerous. So, abstinence based recovery isn't just about not using the substance, right? We are truly creating a new life for ourselves. We are surrendering. We are restructuring our identity, we are committing to a lifelong journey in this process, right? And so for so many people, this model works. It really provides structure and accountability, it provides community and meaning, and it has helped so many people, millions of people, achieve long term sobriety. But is it also very rigid, right? It does not allow for controlled use if you're taking this stance, right? It does not conceptualize improvement on a spectrum, and this is kind of where the debate kind of begins. So the idea of harm reduction kind of takes a different stance. So instead of requiring someone to stop using completely, right, it just focuses on reducing the negative consequences from that use, right? So it kind of looks like different kind of programs put into place, which, can include the syringe service programs, naloxone distribution, safe consumption sites, drug checking services, and medication assisted treatment, which we will go over in the next couple slides in detail. But the core idea of harm reduction is if someone is not able or willing to, at this point in their addiction, to stop using opioids, it is better to reduce the risk and prevent death and improve like overall outcomes than to say, hey, you completely have to get off this drug, right? So I want to just highlight that we already kind of use harm reduction in other areas of our life, right? It doesn't mitigate all risks. Every time you get in the car, right, you have a chance of dying from a car accident, but we do enforce seatbelts and speed limits to hopefully negate that risk every time you get into a car, right? One of the most studied harm reduction strategies is the syringe service programs, or SSPs, and they provide clean syringes and needles to people who inject drugs, and they also collect needles for safe disposal. But they also can provide other things like HIV and hepatitis testing, which we know can come from sharing needles. And they can give out naloxone, and they offer referrals to other treatment programs. Excuse me. As of March 25, there are over 550 operational SSPs within 45 states. The only 5 states that don't have any SSPs are Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Wyoming. And this is a map of Kentucky and all your guys' SSPs locations throughout the state. So supervised consumption sites is the next kind of intervention. And so your SSPs, right, you get your clean needles, but you have to go off site to inject them. You cannot inject them there. So supervised consumption sites or safe consumption sites, they are places that have been identified with staff that you can go use your drugs at, essentially, and there is staff there in case anything kind of goes south, right? So they can interact within if there's an overdose, and they can intervene, right? So it's less common in the US because we have legislation passed in 1986, essentially for crack houses, but it's the crack house statute that sets that we cannot open something and operate it for the purpose of using drugs. So that's kind of how it has been blocked in so many cases. But we do have 3 that are operational, 2 in New York, 1 in Rhode Island. And I believe from the research, I'm not completely sure on this, but I think the way they have gotten around it is because they are state funded by this. They are not requiring federal funding for their safe consumption sites. But we are light years away from the rest of the world. In Europe, There's over 100 of them. The Netherlands leading the way, followed by Germany. Um, in Canada, there's 29. I think in Australia, there's two. So, again, these are just places that you can go to use your drugs. And if something happens, people are there to intervene. Our next intervention is naloxone or Narcan. Narcan is a opioid antagonist, which just means that it has the ability to knock off the already sitting opioids in our receptors, and it can reduce or it can reverse an overdose within minutes. The What I find fascinating is the kind of the evolution of Narcan, because it was for the first 45 years of its existence, it was only available within like a needle form. So that was reserved for really like the hospitals, nursing staff, EMS, anything like that, because for the most part, the public isn't really great with using needles. People don't really like it, people get scared, right? So then in 2015, which is really only a decade ago, the FDA approved a new use of Narcan, which is a spray to be sprayed up the nose to be able to reverse an overdose, which just really increased the one probability of bystanders like using it and the readily availability of it. And then in 2018, uh, we came out with a higher dosage of one, Caloxdu. I don't know. But so if Narcan is 4 mgs, the new higher dosage one is 8. So that is to combat the fentanyl crisis. And then to make it even more readily available in 2023, it was made as an over the counter. So now you can get Narcan if you do have prescription opioids, or it's very readily available in any kind of pharmacy, any kind of clinic, anything like that. So our next one is fentanyl testing strips. So essentially, you can get these very inexpensive, very like readily available testing strips. You can dissolve a little bit of your substance in water and kind of dip it in, almost like a pregnancy test. And it can tell you within minutes if there is fentanyl within your drugs. And I want to be very clear about this, because we aren't glorifying, right, usage. The idea, again, is harm reduction, is preventing death. So the idea with testing drugs is if you do see that there's fentanyl within your drugs, right, you make better informed choices. Whether that is not using that batch, going to your dealer and asking about it, whether that means, using with a friend, using less amount of that drug, making sure you do have Narcan, anything like that in order to prevent a death. So the last intervention before we move on to medication piece of it is Never Use Alone. So Never Use Alone was launched in 2019 by a guy named Mike Brown after he lost his friend to an overdose. So essentially, this is a national hotline open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you can call them if you are consuming drugs alone, and they'll ask you, your name, number, and your exact location. And then after that, you can inject your drug. And after that, they'll hang out. You'll let them know that you're done, and then they'll hang out on the phone with you for a little bit, talk to you. And if you stop responding, after 30 seconds, they will then initiate a EMS call to your exact location. And so far, they've received over 60,000 calls. They've called EMS 250 times, and they have saved 178 people. All right, guys, we are almost there, I promise. About 3 more slides. But this is probably one of the most if not the most important piece of what harm reduction is. It's medication assisted treatment, or MAT. And I just want to clarify what MAT is before we dive in. MAT is FDA approved medication to treat opiate use disorders. These medications are designed to reduce cravings, prevent withdrawal, and lower the risk of overdose. The goal within MAT is not to get someone high, the goal is stability. Remember when we said that our brain is hijacked when we withdraw and we go through pause? This medication is really just helping the brain and the body function without the constant cycle of use and withdrawal. Okay, so the first medication is methadone. So methadone is a full agonist. Okay, so a full agonist means it behaves the same way as what fentanyl and heroin do, right? And so it sits on our opioid receptors and it activates them 100%. Okay, the difference between methadone and heroin is the half-life. So the half-life, it just means half of the time it takes a drug to leave the body, right? So if heroin's half-life is 4 hours, that means it takes 4 hours for half the drug to leave your body. The half-life of methadone is between 24 to 36 hours. So that means it takes that long for half of the substance to leave your body. So it means that it's stable, right? It's not a fast-acting drug, it's slow-acting. So that just means it just sits on your receptors for that amount of time without spiking it, without it going up and down the way heroin does, okay? So methadone is taken orally. It's a liquid, so you have to take it every day. And it's the most probably restrictive medications that we have, because you do have to take it at a clinic every day. So you have to physically go somewhere every day in the morning, usually, to take this medication. They have to watch you ingest it, take it, clear it, all of that before you can leave. Eventually, you could use a take-home service, but that's definitely not within the beginning parts of your recovery. So it's best suited for someone who is long-term use, right? So this is going to be people that are abusing heroin or fentanyl or street drugs or anything like that. But it's important to point out that this itself is an opioid. If you take methadone by itself, will you get high? Yes, absolutely. If you have zero interaction with opioids before, if you take methadone for the first time, will you get high? Yes, that is true. But if you are taking heroin over a long period of time and then you take methadone, are you going to get high? No, right? It itself is an opioid, like I said, right? So you can stack the effects. So if you do use, you're using on top of already an opioid, right? So there's no ceiling effect, if you will. So if you stack something on top of it, if you use something on top of it, you are absolutely able and can overdose on this. So the next one is buprenorphine. It is a synthetic opioid. The names it kind of is under is Suboxone. It's probably the most popular, but is buprenorphine plus naltrexone, or Subutex is just pure buprenorphine. So how a partial agonist works is, well, this is a partial agonist, right? But how it works is it only binds to half of your opioid receptors. So if I think of it like kind of turn up the volume. So if methadone, you're turning the volume all the way up, sitting on the receptors. Subutex is only turning the volume up like halfway. All right, so it works just enough to stop your craving, stop your withdrawal, anything like that. But the good thing about Subutex is it binds to your receptors so heavily, more heavily than heroin or fentanyl. So it doesn't allow anything else to kind of take its seat. Meaning, if you do use on Subutex, the probability of you overdosing is lower because of the receptors are so binded. Like, you cannot replace them already because the Subutex is sitting on them. So in 2022, the X warning label on this was taken off of it. So now anyone can kind of go to their primary care and get a prescription, fill it over the counter, and they can take it home and use it as they need, in the privacy of their own home, which also increases the likelihood of someone taking it, and kind of cuts down the stigma, as far as methadone having to travel every day to a clinic. So it is way easier to access, and it does have a safety net, if you will, as far as the ceiling effect, because it does have the receptors that are binded so heavily to it. Okay, last one, guys. Naltrexone. So, what is naltrexone? Just like our Narcan, it is an opioid antagonist. So it meaning it completely blocks the opioid receptors. Um, Two forms of it: pill form that you take daily, or a once monthly shot, Vivitrol, probably the most popular. Um, but it has to be given by a healthcare professional, so you have to go in monthly to see your doctor to get your Vivitrol shot. This is best suited for people really already leaving controlled environments. I don't think I put this on the slide, but so to be a candidate for naltrexone, you have to already be completely detoxed. And so we're talking 7 to 14 days. A lot of professionals err on the side of caution to push it to the 14 days. So you have to be opioid free, completely, no Subutex, no methadone, no anything like that. You have to be completely free of every substance in order to receive naltrexone, because if you don't, you get really sick. So again, this is best suited for people that are leaving controlled environments, such as like a treatment center or jail or anything like that. But so it completely blocks our opioid receptors. So I think of it like a concrete barrier in like a parking spot. So like you're trying to go park a car, and like you physically cannot get through because there is a concrete barrier right there. That's naltrexone. It is stopping any kind of opioids from coming in. So if you do use on naltrexone, it's just you're not going to feel anything. It completely blocks the effects, which is great while you're on it. But if you do use while you are off of it, say you miss your 30 days, you don't go back for whatever reason, and you try to use what you were using before, you have a very good chance of overdosing at that point, because you're not using an opioid on this medication. Your tolerance definitely decreases over time. So this one has the highest overdose rate if someone returns to use. All right, guys, I lied. One more slide, sorry. Because when we talk about harm reduction, I told you that alcohol has some kind of harm reduction avenues too. Naltrexone also works on alcohol, because when we drink, we release endorphins, and endorphins also bind to our opioid receptors. So essentially, when you drink, and you're on some kind of naltrexone, the oral or the shot, you can still get drunk. You can still feel impaired. You still get the pleasure from the dopamine release and the GABA release, but you don't get the endorphin release. It gets blocked by the naltrexone. So drinking essentially becomes less fun because you're not getting the added endorphins. So over time, the idea is to people stop drinking as much. Another harm reduction method for alcohol is anti-abuse. Anti-abuse People are kind of moving away from it, but essentially, if you drink, it's an oral medication, but if you drink on Antabuse, you just get really, really physically sick, throwing up, heart palpitations, sweating, all this stuff. It makes you really miserable. And here's all my references. I promise all the information that was given was not a lie, and all these are credible sources. So I hope you enjoyed this mini lecture. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.